and welcome back to my channel. This is Marla with Mad About Cards and Crafts. I'm glad you're joining me today. We'll be creating a mixed media card using a 3D embossing folder from Holtz and stepping it up a notch with a few tips and tricks that I want to share with you today. I'll be starting with tip number 1, and that's using magicals on your card panels. These are the colors that I'm using. I will have them up on the screen as I'm giving the instructions. I'm going to spritz my panel with tons of water, and I'm using a dry fan brush. You want to make sure that there's water on your panel so that when you do the tapping of this magical powder, it doesn't get all over your desk. It has something to bind to. I am tapping very lightly. I start in one area and then I tap in other areas of my card panel because I do want to distribute the color all over the panel. I'm not looking for an ombre look or a gradation look. I'm looking to have a panel that has a nice flow, so I chose colors in greens, teals, and blues that are going to blend beautifully together. You want to make sure that the colors that you're using next to each other, as you add the water, it's going to flow, and you want to make sure that they are complementary colors. There is a little bit of movement, as you can see, but I'm going to just really be heavy-handed with my Distress inks, my Distress water sprayer, making sure that I get that movement from the magicals that I've already tapped down. I see where the white space is, and I saved this beautiful Banff blue for those areas. I'm going to spritz it with a lot more water to get more movement, and then I'm going to, as you can see right here, use my microfiber cloth to pick up any of that pooling that happens as the paper warps. So I do have watercolor cardstock. This is Canson XL. Purchased it at Walmart, very inexpensive. You want to make sure that you're going to use a panel that is going to be able to take water. So Tim Holtz watercolor paper, his mixed media paper, this Canson XL, any of those types of papers are going to work beautifully. As you layer colors, you want to make sure that you dry in between. So you can see that I've dried my panel, and now I'm adding additional color that was on my mat. I just did a little bit of a tapping motion. I'm going to use some more of that color and a wet paintbrush. So I have a dry paintbrush for my magicals for splattering them on, and then I'm using this wet paintbrush to splatter on the color that I already have on my desk. I'm going to add some texture to this panel. I first do a clapping motion, which gives me smaller water droplets, and then I put some more water into the palm of my hand and do more of a flicking motion, which is going to give me larger droplets. I use my microfiber cloth to pick up the color, so what that water does is it's going to thin out those intense colors, and when I bring my microfiber cloth down, I'm picking up that color. So I dried my panel, and here I'm using another watercolor panel, and I'm just picking up all of the color that was on my glass mat. You can see that I have a couple variations of teal because once the colors all mixed together, it just created this beautiful teal, and I'm going to build my panel upon this. I just wanted to show you that you don't want to waste any of that ink. I'm going to do some splattering with some water, and then I'm going to tap the magicals on instead of lifting it up. So here I'm adding a little bit of that rusty lantern. I'm going to add some poutine gold, and it's not moving very much, as you can see, even with the water from the splattering that I did. So I'll just move it along with some of the water from the Distress sprayer. It's still not moving as much as I want it to, and so I just take a wet paintbrush. You want to make sure this isn't the paintbrush that's going to go back into your magicals, because you are going to get clumping. So make sure that you don't use that wet paintbrush inside your magicals, but I did a little bit more tapping, adding more layers, drying in between, doing a little bit more spattering or splattering with water, and then I'm adding a little bit more of that teal to the areas where I lost some of the intensity. and I'll add a little bit more of the blue. We'll do a little bit more of the splattering, and then we'll dry the panel, and I'll show you a close-up of both panels together. I just wanted to show you again this second panel so that you can see that you do get a lot of color from a limited use of the magicals. They're filled with tons of powder, so don't be afraid to, pick up any of that color on your desk and just create two panels instead of one. So here I'm going to dry this off, and we're only going to use one of these panels today. First, I'm going to spatter some watercolor on there. I do have this Starry Night. I think it's Gansai Tambi Starry Night. I will link it in the description box below. I'm going to use some of that gold and add it to the panel. I have some white gouache that I've watered down, and I'm doing the same thing, a tapping motion with the paintbrush, which is going to give me, you can see those really fine spatters onto the panel, and it's just adding more texture and more interest. So I really like the 3D embossing folders. I think they're absolutely beautiful, even on plain cardstock, but there's so many different ways that you can use them. And I wanted to share this mixed media approach because I think that it's actually really beautiful. There's both of those panels. I'll use the one on the left. And this is the beautiful engraved 3D embossing folder from Tim Holtz. There is a darker side, which is the deboss side, which is what you want on the top of your panel. And then the bottom side does have the raised edge, and that's going to go underneath. I'll spritz my panel with some water, put it in the embossing folder. The water just helps the panel from not cracking because there is a lot of pressure when you're adding this through your die cutting machine. And there is our beautiful embossed panel. Moving on to our next trick, I do have a sanding block. This happens to be a buffing nail buffer that you can find at any beauty supply store or even the nail polish section at Walmart. It has a very nice sand element to it, and I'm just lightly running it across this panel. And you can see that what I'm doing is taking certain areas of the pattern and I'm rubbing off the magicals, which is going to help that pattern stand out just a little bit more. It's going to serve two purposes. I'm going to leave that white space in some of the areas, but I'm bringing those Gansai Tambi Starry watercolors back again. This time I'm going to use the two golds on the very end, the red gold and this yellow gold, and I'm just adding a little bit of water, not too much because you really want this to be a little bit thicker, and I'm adding it to my index finger, rubbing it across that raised area that I sanded, and I'm going to add that little touch of gold. So my sentiment and the layer underneath this panel is going to be some gold cardstock. So I wanted to incorporate that gold a little bit more. I'm adding, as I mentioned, the two different tones. You could use the Tim Holtz Gilded, I think is what it's called. That would work as well, but I really like to use my watercolors. I think that just keeping them not watered down, but at a thicker consistency really does run smoothly, and you have so many different color choices right here, different shades of gold that you can use with this one palette. So it is very economical. I've had this for about 8 years, and you can see that I still have a ton of watercolor left. Once I get this finished, I'll show you a quick close-up of the panel and you'll see just how beautiful it is. So there's that gold and then there's that white space, and it really does help that pattern stand out. We have the beautiful mixed media background using the magicals. So I hope that you will give this a try. I'm going to add the sentiment onto this white piece of scrap paper. This is called Inspired Hope. It has a coordinating die that has the word hope, so I have both of those pieces. I'm going to use Brutus Monroe's Gilded Embossing Powder and some Versamark ink to just heat emboss a sentiment, a sub-sentiment that's going to say, "May the God of Hope." And then the inside of my card will use the rest of the sentiment that says, "Fill you with all joy and peace as you trust in him." These little faith-based sentiments do come from Papertrey Ink, and they are at a great price point. They are only, for the stamp set, like $4.25 or some $4.50, something like that. I cut it out with a skinny mini banner, and these are the Papertrey Ink Into the Blooms Clover. I've cut several clovers, and there are two different styles of leaves. I'm going to use one of the areas of this embossing folder, and I'm going to add that same texture to these clover leaves. So I spritzed the back of this cardstock. This is Nina Solar White 80-pound cardstock. I ran it through my die cutting machine. You can see that beautiful texture on top. I have two different sizes, both the large and the small clover. I ran all of them through the same way, and I'm adding salvage patina to the larger pieces of clover and tumbled glass to the smaller ones. I'm going to layer these together, and then I'm going to add a little pearl, a gold pearl, and that's going to be from Trinity Stamps. So again, we're tying in the texture from the background, adding the texture to these little clovers. I'm going to just lay one on top of the other, making sure that I'm only adding glue to the center of each of the clovers, because I do want that movement in the clover leaves. And I think that the movement on the leaves really just does add more to the charm when you pull the card out of the envelope. So here's that little pearl that I'm going to add. And then the leaves do not have any embossing at all. So I only added the embossing to each layer of the clovers. I'll bring back in my splat box, and then I'm going to use, of course, that Gansai Tambi Starry watercolor, and we are going to water this down a little bit more than we did when we added it to our embossed panel. And I'm going to be very heavy-handed with the gold watercolor, adding a third color of gold to this. So there's lots of sparkle and shine. There's different shades of the gold. And of course, I did use the gold foiled cardstock, so we have a very elegant, this is actually going to a friend who recently had surgery. So this is a get well card, actually. So here I'm going to use this as a mat. This is 4 by 5¼ inches. I cut my card panel down, the one that we heat embossed and colored, to 3¾ by 5 inches. So we're going to have a nice 1/4 inch border. To not waste that gold foil cardstock, you can see that I did just use a rectangle die from my stash and ran it through the middle so that I can use that other piece for another card. I'll use my wet glue to adhere all this. This gives me a little bit more wiggle room to try to get everything centered, and we're going to start putting our clover cluster together. I really wanted that blue to show in the lower right hand corner, so I'm going to start a little bit high with my placement. This is art glitter glue, and it does dry clear, so I'm not worried. I want that, again, that wiggle room for these clovers, so I'm just kind of placing them down where I think that they should go. They're going to be a little bit high, and so I'll just lift them up and I'll move them down a little bit further. But back to the blue, I really wanted that blue to show in the corner because I really like that contrast between the blue, the green, and the teal. I'm going to tuck these little leaves underneath, so I went with an odd number for the clovers. I like that. I have 2 larger clovers, and then I have 1 small, and then I have 1 of each of this style leaf. I'm going to trim this one down so it tucks a little bit further underneath, and I like that a little bit better. I did add a little bit of foam tape to the back of my sub sentiment so that it has a little pop to that. I always like to add a little bit of dimension to my cards. So I'm going to fiddle with this, and as soon as I lay this down, I'm going to realize, as I said, that the cluster was just a little bit too high up. it doesn't flow very well. So I'll just lift those little clovers up, move them down a little bit, and arrange them a little bit further down, more towards the lower right hand corner, and I'll like that arrangement so much better. Usually I like to cut multiple layers of a larger word, so that word hope is a larger word, and have it more like a chipboard feel, but for some reason I chose not to do that. I did, as I mentioned, add that foam tape to the sub-sentiment, but I didn't add it to any layers to the word hope. I'm just going to have that one sitting back more towards the embossed background. I think that the texture, the colors, the addition of the sanding and the watercolor really did add an elegance to this card. Any sentiment would work for this. I think it would be a beautiful birthday card or even an anniversary card. You could take the flowers off and it would make a great masculine card. So I hope that you give this a try. I want to thank you so much for joining me today. If you like the video, give it a big thumbs up. I'd like to see you back here again. And until next time, I hope you have a fabulous day. Thanks so much for watching.